IVM.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Rachita.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project.
We have as our guest today Gyan Nagpal. Gyan is the author of Future Ready Organization, which we discuss in the first half of the podcast.
In the second half, we discuss A Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela, Abundance by Peter Diamandis, and Dare to Dream, The Life of M.S.Oberoi by Bachi Karkaria. Happy listening.
Strategy in its simplest form is nothing but the art of choice. We all have access to limited resources, money, time, skills, and so on, yet we have unlimited ways to deploy them. Choosing the best application of our resources or energy must be the specific goal of our strategic ambitions. This approach ensures a couple of outcomes. Firstly, it reminds us of the inherent risks in making strategy too complex. People may not understand what they're trying to achieve, may miss the wood for the trees, or underestimate execution dependencies as they implement. Keeping strategy simple and focused on a few critical outcomes helps us drive understanding, execution, and hence success. The second advantage of framing strategic dialogue as the art of choice ensures we achieve essential symmetry between our reality and our imagination. This protects us from strategic overreach, or even worse, an almost immoral lack of ambition.
Thank you, Gyan Nagpal. That was an extract from his book, Future Ready Organization, How Dynamic Capability Management is Reshaping the Modern Workplace. We'll be right back after this to discuss the book in further detail.
Remember the last vacation you took? What about the one you took 3 years ago? Okay, how much do you really remember? It's a question I've asked myself often over a decade of traveling the world. Hey, I'm Utsav, and I do not travel the world for a living. I have a full-time job and responsibilities, but I have made traveling the world a priority. Priority enough that I negotiate extra leave in my job contracts, obsessively track my frequent flyer miles, and I'm willing to take off at the sight of a cheap ticket. Yes, I am cheap. I have lived and worked in 3 countries. I understand human behavior for a living, and these experiences have given me unique insights into places, people, and culture. With over a decade of travel behind me, I increasingly realized one thing, that we cannot see everything. So whatever we see, we must see deeply. Because as the film of memory decays, the imprints which will stand the test of time are the ones felt by the immersion of the senses, not by fleeting encounters with them. Postcards from Nowhere is an immersion into the world of slow travel, one story at a time. Tune in every Thursday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project. I am your co-host Satyajit, otherwise known as Onion Knight in most food circles. I'm hosting this podcast with my co-founder at the Open Library Project, Rachita Sharma.
Hi guys, my name is Rachita and I'm an ex-banker, social impact entrepreneur, podcaster, writer, publisher and inveterate learner. The Open Library Project is a curated library service which is offered to corporates on a subscription basis. The idea here is to create value, build a knowledge community and encourage a growth mindset amongst our members.
Today we have with us on the show Gyan Nagpal. Gyan is a multi-award winning organization development professional who has researched changing talent dynamics across the world. He is also a multiple-time author and his new book, Future Ready Organization, is available to buy all across India. Welcome to the show, Gyan. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Satyajit. Thank you, Rachita, for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And it's just, your book is so inspiring. As an entrepreneur, I feel like I had an entire, lesson on how I should be, taking my organization ahead. And you've spoken about really, really important concepts like healthy restructuring of your organization and, balance sheet talent and strategic talent. So, do tell us what kind of research has gone into this book and, what is the key message that you want to give through Future Ready Organizations?
Okay. So Look, every book is a personal journey. And I
Right.
think a lot of authors will say this, that sometimes you start writing the book to answer a few questions that are important to you as an individual.
Right.
And as your personal narrative emerges, you sort of try and see if that narrative can help others. And then that gives you the courage to try and put what you've understood and learned and what you've been sort of answering for yourself into words that may help, a reader.
Yeah.
And there's so many ways today, right? You can do podcasts like this. You can write blogs. There's so many ways to get your ideas out.
Absolutely.
But I still find that the rigor that a business book takes, particularly, and the pressure it puts on you to put a lot of effort into the research phase is still the golden sort of benchmark, so to speak, for business writing. So every book takes about 2,000 hours. I think both my books took around that time, 3 years of work, and this is work over weekends and airport lounges and after work and in the evening. So it's painful, but if you believe in it, the ideas are compelling enough, then the book eventually emerges.
Right.
So basically you take on all your free time and convert it into work to kind of, in addition to the work you're already doing, you kind of, all your free time gets subjected into writing the book and researching.
Well, I think for authors who have a full-time job or are consultants or professors or whatever else, I mean, you're doing your 50 hours and then you're trying to insulate yourself from, real life challenges and politics and all the stuff that goes on, and getting into this this phase of creative thinking, deep research,
Right.
and so on. So I think in some ways you got to love pain, right?
Okay.
Because it does get pretty painful. The first, couple of weeks, you think I'm writing a book, it's great news. And the next few, months on the weekends, you're sitting at a Starbucks and you're telling everyone I'm writing a book and, I'm so excited about it.
Right.
And then the pain starts, when you start realizing, oh my God, I'm way behind where I should be.
Right. Was it easier for you to write your second book? Because the first book that you wrote came out in 2013 and this book is coming out this year. So did you find that for yourself personally, was it easier to kind of tackle the second book?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I'll tell you what was easier was when I wrote my first book, when I was researching talent economics, I'd quit a great job. And my only ambition was to write a book.
Okay.
And, it was scary because I didn't know if there was another human being on the planet who wanted to read it.
Right.
So initially when the first 500 copies sold, I felt really great about it. Yeah. But in the writing process, there was a lot of anxiety. That I could be an absolute idiot at the end of this, and end up with a lot of egg on my face. Bad decision. Now, I was very lucky, and I think writing is also a very humbling process because suddenly you realize you put a book out, and then your destiny is no longer in your hands. It depends on who picks it up and how they respond to it.
Yeah.
So the second one, I was more reassured. Okay. The first one did incredibly well, much better than I ever thought it would.
Yeah.
And so the second one, I sort of knew I had a readership. I knew that, I could be a little more ambitious with the second book. But on the other hand, the first book was about talent. And, I was a talent practitioner. I was a strategist in this space. I was writing to my strength.
Right.
The second book is about the future of business. It's very, very broad. So it was like going from a sailboat to a container ship in some ways.
Right.
The research methodology, the journey we had to travel across oceans this time, the relevance of the message, across 5 continents, different economic theaters, developing, emerging. It had to make a lot of sense.
Absolutely. In fact, exactly what you mentioned. In a developing economy, this book would be quite disruptive from the traditional mindset of most organizations. But, do tell us why this is the need of the hour and why every organization should be, aiming towards being this kind of an organization.
Okay, it's a great question, Rachita. So, there's a ton of research now out there.
Right.
That shows that executives feel the old-fashioned industrial architecture of business isn't working anymore. The pyramidical, insular-looking structures that we've grown up with over 200 years of the industrial economy.
Yeah.
Right.
Today, when you look at those structures, they trap resources.
Yeah.
They ossify over time.
Yeah.
They resist change, and so on. But the problem is that very few executives in this research are saying they know what they want to do about it.
Okay.
So we're in this, a lot of executives feel trapped.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're in this position where we know something's wrong, but we don't know what to do about it. I think there was research that came out from Deloitte and also Mercer a couple of years ago, which said 93% of executives want to change the structure of their organization and change the way it works, increase flexibility, enhance, change resilience. But only 11% felt confident that they had some of the answers.
Yeah.
Right.
So the future-ready organization sits squarely in this gap.
Right.
It's for people looking for answers. It doesn't give you all the answers. It's not the only answer. There may be hundreds of answers out there, but it shows you one minimum viable proposition of how to take a traditional business and make it compete with the disruptors of today.
That's
Right.
fantastic. Yeah. Even the extract that you read on transformation, it kind of puts things in the right context or perspective, where it's kind of like, you need to change inherently to actually see the change happening. It's not superficial change that will make you a future-ready organization. Your systems, processes need to kind of evolve into those of this century rather than those of the last century.
Right.
Right.
You have to let go.
Yeah.
I think the biggest message that I have learned for myself is that we're inherently smart people and we're well-intentioned people and we've got great experiences. So there's nothing which stands in our way to build the great institutions of tomorrow.
Absolutely.
But the biggest hurdle is we resist and we don't let go of past success.
Yeah.
Right.
And the moment you do so, you sort of drop your baggage. Suddenly you open yourself up to great possibilities.
But that's, I think, kind of easier said than done in terms of you're so confident because you've succeeded. So, to kind of take a step back and reimagine that, what may have worked for me maybe 10 years ago will not work for me today is again challenging. And also what you mentioned for, the managers or the executives who have whose job it is to train the genius under them, to recognize the genius and kind of give them more creative freedom. I'm just wondering, how does that kind of transformational change, how would that happen in an organization? Because again, the power structures currently are that, it's pyramidal, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, in fact,
any thoughts on?
I'll add to Satyajit's point, like you've mentioned in the book, that, the most important talent in your organization is the strategic talent, which we should be concentrating on. And even companies like Apple have, their biggest supplier is their competitor Samsung, and they have outsourced a lot of their requirements to their biggest competitor. So how do you get into that phase of I should outsource this because this is not the key focus of my organization, and I should hire this kind of talent because strategy is what I should concentrate on.
Yeah. So I think Rachita, it's a good question, because hidden in there is I think some of the principles of modern business.
Right.
What is a competitor? And I think that's a very maybe 19th or 20th century way of looking at the world. I think today the breakthrough business leaders are focused on only two questions. The first is, how can I reduce the customer's pain? And if you have an idea that sits in that space, then honestly, you're not necessarily trying to replace something that exists. You're creating something new.
Right.
And the second is, how do I monetize this idea? There are only two questions that you have to ask yourself. And then the moment you start asking yourself the third question, it's going to take away or distract you from the first two.
Yeah.
So, who's my competitor, and, can I collaborate with them? The fiercest competitors today are collaborating.
Right.
Because that's the nature of 21st century business.
Absolutely. I think, we are dependent. I think if you are collaborating and networking, you have a higher chance of staying, in the system than trying to compete with everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you see this at the cutting edge of any human endeavor. So, you look at sports as an example. You have someone like Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal on the court. They're willing to kill each other.
Yeah.
But they both respect that they are stewards of the game of tennis as a whole.
Right.
And therefore they have to also collaborate at one level to ensure that the game doesn't come into disrepute, that their behavior inspires millions of children. You look at cricket, for example. The gentleman's game, there are certain behaviors there are boundaries that you don't step out of, because you respect the game more than just the result on the day.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we've got to start thinking about, pushing human endeavor in business. That, yes, we compete. We've got products that, that compete for the same share of wallet. But on the other hand, we're not going to destroy the environment.
Yeah.
We're not going to be, sort of irresponsible corporate citizens. And where it makes sense to come together and, sort of with the right firewalls and Chinese walls between our business, to share some of what we know, or, so supply to one another as the case you made.
Right.
Why not?
Yeah. And you also speak about agile management. So, could you share a little more on what you mean by that?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the core hypotheses in the book is that management is lost. The science of management is urgently in need of a reboot. And we're seeing green shoots in technology businesses and so on, agile and, Scrum and so on and so forth. These are experiments which have been made in new businesses around how, work can be done and the role management plays. But if you look at traditional industry, the last 40 years, managers have defined themselves as supervisors of performance. And what this means is that they look at their jobs as squeezing greater and greater performance out of the same employees year on year. It's like squeezing water out of stone.
Yeah.
Punching, numbers on the treadmill, going faster and faster, and expecting people to keep up with it. And of course, you see the repercussions of this, the consequences of this behavior in low loyalty and low engagement and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
In my view, 21st century management, future-ready management, is less about supervising performance and more around cultivating capability and curating contribution from a diverse talent ecosystem. So the moment managers sort of look at the entire network of capability that they have access to. It's not just employees. Employees are a very small part of the modern, capability ecosystem. We're buying, services all the time. We've got strategic partnerships. We've got institutional arrangements. We're using gig workers. We're using agencies to drive what we need. We're accessing just-in-time capability along with, yes, a few full-time resources on our rolls. So the book puts a framework out there for organizations to discover their talent recipe and then curate contribution from this entire network of resources that they currently use.
Right.
Fantastic. And I just want to touch upon artificial intelligence and, the kind of fear that's around artificial intelligence, that the jobs are going to go away. I think your extract put it really well, in terms of that we're looking at a human-machine partnership.
Correct.
Rather than, replacement of humans by machines. So if you can give us your thoughts a little more, in a little more elaborate manner on
Sure.
AI.
Sure. So I'm a big follower of a psychologist by the name of Herbert Simon.
Okay.
And Herbert Simon won the 1978 or 79 Nobel Prize in Economics. He's the first of two psychologists to win it, behavioral scientists to sort of win it. And his core hypothesis in his 1957 book was that we as mankind make terrible decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one defining characteristics of mankind is that we make atrocious decisions. And he explains why.
Okay.
He says that, there are three things required to make the perfect decision. The first is all the information required to be able to make that decision. The second is the computing power to put all that information together and allow the right, sort of options to emerge. And the third is the time required to do all of this, gather the information and compute it. So because the human mind can't necessarily, in the complexity of the world we live in today, maybe, 1,000 years ago, evolution had equipped us to making the right fight, flight decisions, hunter-gatherer decisions or whatever. But the way the world is today, there's no way on earth that we, can bring all these variables together. So Simon says that we become good at satisficing, looking for good enough solutions. And in most cases, these good enough solutions are actually atrocious in the long run.
Right.
So they may solve a short-term need,
Yeah.
but they destroy the planet, for example,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So I think that's where the man-machine partnership can be really powerful, because we have to see machines as an ally
Yeah.
to do what the human mind cannot.
Right.
And that's what, I've written a whole chapter on this in the Future Ready organization, on how I imagine the man-machine partnership, and 8 examples of how it is already working and solving problems for us all.
And it's exactly that, right? You're outsourcing stuff that the machine can do, and then you're concentrating on, more important things for your organization.
That's right.
So, yeah. And so before we, wind up the first half, I just wanted to ask you 2 questions. One is, what is the effect of sound HR strategies on an organization? And who would you recommend this book to?
Okay. Look, firstly, I'm not an HR expert. I'm just a curious learner. I'm a researcher who likes to stay with questions for a while.
Right.
And by staying with these questions over the last 10 odd years, I think I've built expertise as a talent strategist and an organization architect. That's what I try and focus all my learning agenda on. So from my perspective, I don't think any of the solutions that we're looking for can emerge from one function anymore.
Okay.
The functional architecture is way past its best use date by a couple of decades, I think.
Yeah.
So all that I think about is, how do we get business leaders to bring all their functional experts to the table and gather around the big questions? And we've got to gather with honesty and intention, right? While simultaneously taking off our fancy hard hats and our fancy titles and so on and so forth. Because the reality, as I observe it today, is that we have a lot of very smart people trapped in very dumb jobs.
Yeah.
So the audience for this book, I think, second part of your question, is anyone in business with an eye on the future and genuine curiosity about work and business in the post-digital age will enjoy reading a Future Ready organization.
Yeah, I have read it and I think it's fantastic. So I would recommend anybody, especially people who've just started up, you must read this book.
I think one of the things that the book does is kind of deals with the fear of technology and the fear of the future, which is kind of, by human nature, we kind of are drawn to this fear or being driven by these fears. And I think what your book does brilliantly is kind of sheds the optimistic light on the future and how things can work really, really well, and how we can evolve into a better life from a better business life as well.
Very valid examples.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
I am an optimist. I think mankind, has a strong conscience, collective conscience, and it allows us to, very messily though, and very noisily though also, but it helps us tune ourselves to the right things that need to be done. And be it in what we see happening around the environment and plastics and stuff today, or be it the world of work and making work meaningful for the talent of tomorrow, for the organizations of tomorrow, for the shareholders of tomorrow. I think we're retooling almost every part of human existence and human endeavor continuously. So I'm a huge optimist for what I see coming.
That's a great thought.
On that note, we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back after this.
Hey everybody, welcome to another amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, you know what? I'm tired of asking you to follow us. This time I expect you to follow us. Please make sure you follow us. If you're not following us, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Seriously, I'm sure many of you would like that, but that's the only threat I have. We'd also like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Thank you, Storytel. Thank you, Intel. We're really grateful for your support. On Advertising is Dead, Varun is joined by none other than Ranveer Alabadia, better known as Beer Biceps in the digital space, also the host of our short-lived podcast, Hustle Science. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Ashutosh Shrotriya, business head at Religare Insurance Company. They talk about health insurance and how to choose a good insurance plan. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by Ambar Qureshi, founder of the Plum Tree and former plus-size model. They talk about body positivity, self-belief, and the idea behind starting her own clothing venture. On Paperback, Rachita and Satyajit talk to Gyan Nagpal, the author of The Future Ready Organization. They discuss the new strategies that can make every element of an organization productive and how we can break the hierarchical structures within. On Heel and Hearty, Rachna is joined by two working professionals, Navaneel Kaur and Manvi Pathak, who talk about how to maintain a work-life balance and a healthy lifestyle. On our Kannada podcast, Thale Harate, Rohit Shenoy sits down with Ganesh Chakravarti and Pawan Srinath to talk about primary education in India and Karnataka. This week on Edges and Sledges, Ashwin, Varun and DJ talk about the India versus Bangladesh first day night test at Eden Gardens. On Golgappa with Trupti Khamkar, Trupti is joined by Indrajit More, content creator at Bhadipa and Bhatupa, who gives tricks and tips to travel on a shoestring budget. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik is joined by angel investor, business and strategist Lloyd Matthias. Lloyd talks about the technological entrepreneurship space in India, things to look for potential investments, and how brands should be transparent with their communications in order to create a strong identity. On Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Janice and Anirudh talk about the highly rated show this year, Succession. On 9XM Soundcast, Eva is in conversation with Bollywood singer Palak Muchal. She has lent her voice to movies like MS Dhoni, Ashiki 2 and Prem Ratan Dhan Payo. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome back, guys. We still have with us Gyan Nagpal, author of Future Ready Organization. Hey, Gyan. That was a fantastic first half. I think we learned a little more on how to be a little less fearful about the future. So, the next book that we are going to discuss is Abundance by Peter Diamandis. Tell us a little bit about this book and why it kind of stood out for you.
Okay. Thanks for that question, Satyajit. And you asked me in the preparation to think about books that I would really like to talk about and, my favorite books. And I went back to the books that I've read and reread, and Abundance is one of them. I think I've read it thrice since the first time in 2014.
Okay.
And in the first half of this podcast, we spoke a little bit about how the human mind and the amygdala hijack or whatever, we're seduced by fear, we're seduced by the negative.
Yeah.
And we tend to focus on, problems rather than solutions more readily. And this is a book that clearly takes us into the future, on a very optimistic note. Abundance is all about solving the great problems the world has. And the technologies that are already in play or on the threshold of becoming commercially viable that can help us make quantum leaps in the directions that we want to. So, we spoke about AI earlier. Yeah. I think Peter in Abundance talks a lot about, renewable energy.
Right.
And what energy, the big transformation in energy, the big disruption in renewables will do to the world economy.
Right.
And how it allows more and more people a better life and a better lifestyle and a route out of poverty the moment we can make the energy economics of the world shift towards renewables. Similarly, poverty and hunger and technologies like aquaponing and several other very promising breakthroughs that will allow us to use urban sort of farming and other solutions to solve hunger, essentially, and bring down prices,
Right.
so to speak. So one of the great thoughts in abundance is to not always force yourself to think out of the box, but to think in the right box.
Right.
And I love that that analogy that he gives us, because I think we're also the last 30 odd years, since the thinking hats and all of that, it's always been about thinking out of the box and being an out of the box thinker.
Sometimes you're trying to think so different, you're losing focus of what you actually want to do, just trying to be different. So, yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. This book, Abundance, and even your book, in fact, personally, I get asked a lot of times that why are you so optimistic about the future? And, it's been something I've been thinking about for the last maybe 2 months, as what has led to my optimism in general. And of course, while reading your book also, I kind of found that you are also your book kind of says that you're an optimistic person about the future, or like things that are going to happen in the future. And the reason that I found that I actually think about it is, I saw a video by the creator of the string theory, Dr. Michio Kaku, in 2011, where he talks about we're stepping into the age of abundance, and kind of that video was released in 2011, and now going back, I've seen it every year at least 3-4 times, and it's just been proven again and again that what he predicted came through. Like, just
like 1984. So.
Just that's the opposite. So are there any, obviously reading these books, your book as well as Abundance, would give you a great way to start thinking about things optimistically, but are there any other changes you can make to sort of inculcate this mindset in your general life or general business life?
It's a great question. I think specifically, Satyajit, we are custodians of the future.
Okay.
And, I have 2 young kids. One's 18, one's 12. So I ask myself this all the time. What world are we leaving for our future generations? How can I coach them and advise them on education, and not just the formal education and stuff, but things they should learn, things they should focus on, what kind of value systems will help them in the future. And I think my optimism about the future comes from my interest in history.
Okay.
And if you really see human history, we have solved a ton of problems in the past.
Right.
And it doesn't always look that way, because we end up reading only the interesting episodes in history, the events, the war, something that can be neatly packaged. We don't read about, changes that happened over 200 years systemically.
Right.
But you look at India and how we have let go of, horrific traditions, how we have, we're fighting the battle towards greater equality, equality across different segments of our society, but also equality across genders, and so on and so forth. Now, it isn't always as clean. It doesn't look always, neatly packaged up in the here and now. But I'm very optimistic that in the future, mankind will have a greater awareness of the role they play with regards to other living creatures, the planet. Mankind will have a greater awareness of the role it can play in the prosperity of future generations, and I see shoots of this already, in our narrative. The point is, you got to stop reading the newspapers. I stopped reading the newspapers a few years ago.
Okay.
To be honest, I gather my news from interesting writers. I curate my own news. You can do that today.
Oh my God!
Follow the right.
So
you follow the right people.
Say that.
You follow the right people on Twitter and other and you can sort of create a cabal of like-minded disruptive thinkers. I think it's very important to always be aware of the counterpoint, but not immerse yourself in the counterpoint to the point where it hijacks your thinking.
Yeah, most of the times when I am listening to news, all I can hear is shouting.
Correct.
And I feel like the point is lost somewhere in the screaming and yelling between, two parties who are trying to make their point. And yeah, so that's exactly what I feel. And that's why even I prefer to, consume news in different, like maybe in shorts or somewhere where I don't have to hear someone talking so that I'm getting what I need to take in. Right?
That's true.
Great. So the next book that we are moving on to is A Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela, of course, we all know him, and he's a very famous figure for the work he did in South Africa. And tell us why this book stands out for you personally. Like usually, it would be like a Gandhi book or something like that people would be inspired by.
Well, I have tremendous respect for Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru and all the people who built this great nation. But they came from a generation before mine.
Right.
So sometimes, when you're trying to read what they've done, of course, we appreciate and we read and we learn from their experiences. But sometimes trying to figure out their context and the sensibilities of their age and stuff for someone who's, the 40s or 50s today is a little difficult. Our parents knew it better.
Right.
Now, the beauty of Nelson Mandela is he's someone in that same bracket of great leaders who I feel more connected to because his story played out pretty much in my adulthood, his release from prison and so on. So I picked up A Long Walk to Freedom in Singapore Airport 2011 when I was on my way to South Africa. It was my first trip to South Africa. I went there 12 times since then, 6 years, and I did a lot of work in South Africa. So I picked up the book. It's a tome. It's 700 pages, and it's quite intimidating in the beginning. But then when you start reading about his childhood and so on, you start understanding the person he was. And I actually went to his cell in Robben Island, off Cape Town, and I read some section sitting on a bench there.
Wow.
Around his 27 years interned as a prisoner, I went to the limestone mine where he had to breathe in that limestone dust for 27 years, the little cave they took shelter in for their lunch breaks from the sweltering sun. The southern hemisphere sun can burn your body in minutes. So it was fascinating to read it while on these voyages to South Africa and these journeys that I had, as a consultant and with a big community in South Africa, supporting talent economics.
Right.
And then when he died in the southern summer of 2013, I was in Johannesburg. And I went back to his museum. I read the book when I came back from that trip again. And it again, taught me a lot. I only read the second half of the book. I think what he teaches us is profound. And there are so many books that talk about servant leadership, that talk about leading from behind and so on and so forth. But it is in the life of Nelson Mandela that you can really see the impact of service, a leader's role in serving a greater need. He always uses the analogy of a shepherd.
Right.
That he picks the direction, he knows where he wants, the flock to go, but he doesn't lead from the front. And that is so powerful, particularly given the largely Western narrative that a leader has to be in front and leading by example and very visible and a rock star leader. I don't think that model works in the Eastern Hemisphere and large parts of the Southern Hemisphere at all. So Mandela's book was a very, very powerful counterpoint and a very powerful treatise on how you need to lead societies. Great champion of equality, a great humility as a leader, and his ability to forgive people who had tormented him. And lead the country forward was just unbelievable.
Yeah, that's a beautiful take on his life, actually. And I think the kindness that with which he did everything is very attractive. And as a leader, it's very inspirational to see that there are other ways of tackling the situation.
True.
So definitely a must read, I believe.
A great example of a leader who led with empathy and not in the usual.
Yeah, it's not like, he's instructing and
Yeah.
leading, but he's leading by...
He was a tough leader,
Yeah.
right? And he needed to be. If you look at the African National Congress at that time and the challenges that he had to grapple with, the animosity and the anger that existed in the majority community against the white population, and how he very, very smartly managed South Africa through. I don't think any country would ever wish to be in that 10 or 12 year phase that he was in charge, and he did it with exceptional foresight and exceptional humility and exceptional integrity. Fascinating. And he did it in our age, where we've seen, the vast majority of country leaders, on the other side of the fence.
Right.
With not the right value systems. Here is a man who showed us it can be done.
Fantastic. And the last book that we're going to discuss today is Dare to Dream by Bachi Karkaria. And this is the story of M.S.Oberoi. And tell us a little bit about this book. You have a very interesting story, right?
Well, firstly, what I'd say is that Bachi is a very gifted writer.
Yeah.
Such great prose, the ability to connect with a reader. Wow, I've read this book for the story and what it meant to me, but I've also read it for just her writing.
Right.
And I picked up this book in 1992.
Okay.
And I was in college then in Mumbai, and like every commerce student at that time, my only thought was get a job, get an MBA or whatever else, and deep down I didn't want to. I felt I've been quite distressed with formal education and quality of thinking in formal education. So I read this book, and it was about this great human being, this hotel clerk who worked incredibly hard, started his first hotel, or bought over his first hotel, the Clark's in Shimla, and then revived the Grand in Calcutta, and built this hospitality empire on a few fundamental principles of quality, of really putting the guest first, of international standards in an India that never really understood international standards. So he was a maverick in many ways.
Right.
And I remember reading this book, and after reading it in 1992, there was only one company that I wanted to work for, and that was the Oberoi Group. So I spent 6 months preparing for an interview. Spent every afternoon at the Stock Exchange Library going through Economic Times 20 years ago.
Right.
And I knew their financials better than the CFO, I think. No, I take that back. I thought I did. And I went for this interview, and they were astonished. They said, we've never seen someone so prepared. And of course, I got the job. I spent 10 years at the Oberoi Group.
Wow.
Yeah.
My 10 formative years straight out of college, and they changed me as a human being, and set my quality orientation, set my resilience at a level where I don't think I would have been able to do that anywhere else.
And when you joined the Oberoi Group, was it as you expected? Because you had researched so much, you had read the book as well, and were you kind of...
Did it live up to
the hype, or...
Much more so.
Right.
Much, much more so. Of course, you want to follow great leaders.
Yeah.
Right? I think that is a very important message to any 18 to 21-year-old out there, is that don't just think of the brand and think of the salary slip and the job title or whatever. Right. Follow a great leader.
Right.
And follow the culture that a great leader can instill in the organization that shapes your career and future. And for me, that is what the book really did. It sort of told me this person knows how to create an international business in India. Mm-hmm. A quality benchmark which is unheard of at that time. And this person has resilience. They're able to go through the hard times. They're able to have a vision to, we're sitting in Mumbai, you see the Oberoi Towers out there. My God, the great leaders who can think about this, be it Jamshedji Tata with the Taj. These are mavericks. These are people who can think well beyond, what their peers can.
Yeah.
And he was such an individual. And I sort of said, I want to be a manager here, and I studied very hard, and it was humbling. You clean toilets and you serve food and you wash dishes and you do all sorts of things that we're quite we don't think is part of management, but believe me, it is the core essence of any manager's reality. The ability to do every job that you expect another human being to do with a smile and with passion for quality is what makes great leaders.
That is brilliantly said.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, these are your few favorite books that you've read a few times, right? Can you tell us who your favorite authors are as well?
Yeah, so now the favorite authors is a tricky question because there may be about 100. But let me tell you the two that I really consider a notch above their peers and have helped me as an author too. So in fiction writing, I think it would be without a doubt Michael Lewis.
Okay.
And he's written some blockbusters and The Big Short and Moneyball and stuff like that. But I love his narrative style. He's probably the best economic storyteller there is out there.
Okay.
And he's got such a simple narrative style, such simple prose, such uncomplicated writing that it almost is therapeutic reading about business. The thing about Michael is that he's probably the best of the pop non-fiction writers in his generation, and I've loved reading each and every one of his books. Boomerang, which was the non-Wall Street narrative of the financial crisis. What happened in Iceland after politicians and bankers destroyed the economy, so on and so forth. The journey through the devastation. What a great book. And so I've learned a lot from his writing style as a business author. So I'd pick Michael Lewis as my first choice. And the second one is from the heart, right? So the first one was from the head, the second was from the heart. And it's probably John Ronald Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. What a writer.
Oh, yeah.
What an, just his ideas.
Yeah.
Beyond his prose and poetry, just his ideas, to come up with that magnum opus, all of that in his head.
Yeah.
And then to put it down. He was a linguist. He was he used to work at the Oxford Dictionary.
Right.
In the early part of his career, he was a professor of English later. And then to invent, this story is just mind-blowing. So I read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit before the movies, and then I saw the movies, and then I read it again. It was like reading the first version in black and white and the second one in color.
Wow.
And it was so powerful for me.
So did you find that after watching the movies, did you reread the books after watching the movies?
Yes, I did.
You did?
I did. I had no ambition to. I'd sort of read it, so I was vaguely aware of the story, and then I saw the movies. The movies are fantastic.
Yeah.
And then I said, oh my God, Bilbo, Frodo,
Yeah.
what a journey. Let me go back to the book. I had the books, so I pulled them out, I reread them, and it was just something else.
Personally, as a child, I've read The Hobbit more than 1,000 times, easily.
Wow.
It used to be my go-to book, when I'm bored, just read it and get immersed in that Tolkien-esque world, it's fantastic. So great. It was a great conversation, Gyan. I think we personally, as well as a lot of our listeners, will be enlightened as to how to be less fearful about the future and
more optimistic.
And one thing I think that you made a very excellent point, and it was that you should follow the right people. You should follow good thought leaders. You should follow people who you look up to and kind of, curate your own following so that you're not inundated by kind of the fake news or the fake things that are going around.
It's a critical skill to
21st century skill.
It's a 21st century skill.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, thank you. So, Gyan, where is Future Ready organization going to be available?
Well, we're launching the book tomorrow and day after, so it's a recently released book. You can definitely get it on Amazon, Flipkart, and the online channels. But I think most good Indian bookstores would also host the title now. as it's recently released.
Fantastic.
Great. And we can connect with you on Twitter and LinkedIn at Gyan Nagpal, right?
I think so. I think it's Gyan Nagpal on Twitter for sure. I'm not very active on social media, but I do have a Twitter account, a Facebook page, and a LinkedIn account.
Great. And a big thank you to all our listeners. You can follow the Open Library Project on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for latest updates on our events. And stay tuned for the next Paperback podcast on IVM Podcasts. Happy reading. You can follow IVM Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at IVM Podcasts. Listen to Paperback on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Who said healthy food is boring? Who said raw veggies is just salads? Who said eating fats makes you fat? Look forward to my recommendations on healthy food and exercise hacks on the Kinetic Living podcast with me, Coach Urmi, every Wednesday on the IVM app, website, and anywhere you get your podcast from.
How many times have you motivated yourself to improve your sleep, or lose weight, or be more productive? How many times have you failed? Hi, my name is Ashton Doctor. Tune into my show, The Habit Coach Podcast, where we focus on creating small, tiny habits to improve your life instead of those big, impossible tasks. So make listening to me a habit every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com or on your favorite podcasting app.